shortly and briefly about climate change and what's happening with the Colorado River. I watched a video recently, Answers with Joe. If you guys haven't seen Answers with Joe, he's absolutely amazing. He does a lot of great science videos, and just very interesting topics a lot of times. So I highly suggest going to check him out as well. It's Joe Scott, I believe, is his channel. But the Colorado River is drying up, and is drying up fast. And that is bad news. Bad news for something like 15% of the population of the United States of America, which is a pretty large number. So let me take a look at this article here. 40 million people rely on the Colorado River, and it's drying up fast. Let's see here. On a 110-degree day several years ago, surrounded by piles of sand and rock in the desert outside Las Vegas, I stepped into a yellow cage large enough to fit 3 standing adults and was lowered 600 feet through a black hole into the ground. There at the bottom, amid pooling water and dripping rock, was an enormous machine driving a cone-shaped drill into the earth. The machine was carving a cavernous 3-mile tunnel beneath the bottom of the nation's largest freshwater reservoir, Lake Mead. Lake Mead, a reservoir formed by the construction of the Hoover Dam in 1930s, is one of the most important pieces of infrastructure on the Colorado River, supplying fresh water to Nevada, California, Arizona, and Mexico. The reservoir hasn't been full since 1983. In 2000, it began a steady decline caused by apocal drought. On my visit in 2015, the lake was just about 40% full. A chalky ring on the surrounding cliffs marked where the water line once reached. Like the residue on the empty bathtub, the tunnel far below represented Nevada's latest salvo in a simmering water war. The construction of 1.4 billion drainage hole to ensure that if the lake ever ran dry, Las Vegas could get the very last drop. Yeah, that's really crazy. They're stretching it. They're trying to preserve as much as possible. For years, experts in the American West have predicted that unless the steady overuse of water was brought under control, the Colorado River would no longer be able to support all of the 40 million people who depend on it. Over the past 2 decades, Western states took incremental steps to save water, signed agreements to share what was left, and then, like Las Vegas, did what they could do to protect themselves. But they believed the tipping point was still a long way off. They were wrong. Look at that. So there's where the water line was. You kind of see that there. It's crazy. Like the record-breaking heat waves and the ceaseless megafires, the decline of the Colorado River has been faster than expected. This year, even though rainfall and snowpack high up in the Rocky Mountains were near normal levels, the parched soils and plants stricken by intense heat absorbed much of the water, and inflows to the Lake Powell were around 1/4 of their usual amount. The Colorado's flow has already declined by nearly 20% on average from its flow through the 1900s. And if the current rate of warming continues, loss could well be 50% by the end of this century. Now, what's that mean? That means hell is about to break loose in these areas. It means that there's going to be a lot of problems for the people who rely on these water reservoirs. Americans are about to face all sorts of difficult choices about how and where to live as the climate continues to heat up. So see, this is, most people think of climate migration coming from coastal regions where there's hurricanes and things like that happening. But you don't think about the places where there's going to be major droughts and what's going to happen to those displaced people as well. States will be forced to choose which coastlines to abandon as sea levels rise, which wildfire-prone suburbs to retreat from, and which small towns cannot afford new infrastructure to protect against floods or heat. What to do in parts of the country that are losing their essential supply of water may not turn out to be the first among those choices. The Colorado River's enormous significance extends well beyond the American West. In addition to providing water for the people of 7 states, 29 federally recognized tribes of northern Mexico, its water is used to grow everything from the carrots stacked on supermarket shelves in New Jersey to the beef in a hamburger served in Massachusetts diner. The power generated by its 2 biggest dams, the Hoover and Glen Canyon, is marketed across an electricity grid that reaches from Arizona to Wyoming. So this is a widespread problem. You might think, okay, well, we don't live in that area, so we're not, it's not going to bother us. But what about all those people that gets displaced from there and have to move and take up other resources? What about the resources that are developed there in these places that will no longer be able to be developed there? So making the rise of food costs higher, and causing shortages in vegetables and meat and all kinds of different produce products and things like that. It's really going to cause some issues. The former declaration of a water crisis arrived days after the Census Bureau released numbers showing that even as the drought worsened over recent decades, hundreds of thousands more people had moved to the regions that depend on the Colorado. That you see Denver and several other places that have like exploded in population, a lot of because things like marijuana legalization and things such as that nature, which is why, again, they should probably legalize it around the country so they're not having to push everybody who is an advocate for such things into one area, right? Phoenix expanded more over the past 10 years than any other large American city, while smaller urban areas across Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and California each ranked among the fastest growing places in the country. The river's water supports roughly 15 million more people today than it did when Bill Clinton was elected president in 1992. These statistics suggested that the climate crisis and explosive development in the West are on a collision course, and it raises the question, what happens next? Well, we can kind of extrapolate what's going to happen next. A fucking hellscape of mass migration and craziness in this country. A lack of food distribution. It's and people call people alarmists for really being scared about this kind of stuff, but it's not alarmist at all. It's definitely there's definitely some problems here going on that we need to address quickly, or we're in a lot of trouble. Since about 70% of water delivered from Colorado River goes to growing crops, not to people in cities, the next step will likely be to demand large-scale reductions for farmers and ranchers across millions of acres of land, forcing wrenching choices about which crops to grow and for whom. An omen that many of America's food-generating regions might ultimately have to shift someplace else as the climate warms. California, so far shielded from major cuts, has already agreed to reductions that will take in effect if the drought worsens, but it may be asked to do more. Its enormous share of the river, which it uses to irrigate crops across the Imperial Valley and for Los Angeles and other cities, will be in the crosshairs when negotiators over a diminished Colorado begin. The Imperial Irrigation District, there is the largest single water rights holder from the basin and has been especially resistant to compromise over the river. It did not sign the drought contingency plan, laying out cuts that other big players on the Colorado River system agreed to in 2019. So New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming, states in the river's upper basin, will most likely face pressure to use less water. Should that happen, places like Utah that hoped that one day support faster development and economic growth with their share of the river may have to surrender their ambition. So you guys can see where this is going, right? Like, it's being eroded and dried up to the point where it's going to affect not just them, but the whole nation in ways that we can't even completely fathom yet. So this is something we never definitely need to keep an eye on, because and we need to make some changes. We need to start looking at alternative forms of energy. We need to start working on mitigation plans to help with displaced people, and to figure out ways to supplement our food supply. And we're going to need to figure out just how we're going to survive all of this. So it's not a joke. It's climate change isn't something that may happen. It's something that's happening right now, and we really need to get off our asses and do something about it, and stop listening to people who are saying that we're alarmists for saying what's actually happening in the world with these things.